Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome. We're excited for another fantastic Banking Buzz program. My special guest today is going to be Therese Kuvaas. If you joined us for our last program, you'll know that Therese and I talked about some pre-election issues. At that time, the DFL had the trifecta. They had the governor's office, they had control of the Senate by one seat, and they also had control of the House. In the pre-election edition, we were talking about hoping to get some balance in the state government. And what that meant was maybe you'd see some changes in the House of Representatives. Today, we're going to do a post-election recap. I don't know that that would be required every year, but this year was not a typical election. So we do need to go over some of the weirdness that's happening in Minnesota government. Also, before we get started, I wanted to remind everyone that MBA's Bank Day at the Capitol is coming up on February 11th. We hope you'll be able to join us that day to head down to the Capitol and visit with your representatives and your senators. And then also the MBA's Washington, D.C. trip is set for April 29th. If you haven't gone on that D.C. trip, I would highly encourage you to give it a shot. It's really a fantastic program, getting a chance to meet with our members of Congress out in DC and also with the regulatory agencies. It really is a fantastic experience. Hopefully you'll be able to clear your calendar and get out to join us on April 29th. So as I said, my special guest today for the program is Therese Kuvaas, MBA's Senior Government Relations Manager. Therese, we kind of have a lot to unpack this time. But let's start with the news that we received on election night. What were the election results for the U.S. House races?
Good morning. Thank you everybody for joining us today. For the Minnesota House in Congress, we have 8 members, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats. Nothing really changed there. Actually, I think you more solidified those 4 seats for the Republicans and 4 seats for the Democrats. The only change that we saw was Dean Phillips, who decided not to run this past year, took on President Biden briefly to run for president, and with that decided to step aside to run for Congress, so no longer run for Congress. And Kelly Morrison, who was a sitting state senator from the Orono area, decided to run for the 3rd congressional district, and she ended up winning that seat. So that is a new seat, and she will be sitting on the Small Business Committee.
Absolutely. And there weren't any changes on the Senate side. Neither of our senators were up for election.
Well, Bashar was up for election.
Excuse me.
But it was very, very easy.
Very easy. That's right.
So, yes.
I forgot about that because it was so easy. So, excellent. So then the other thing we had to look at was the Minnesota House of Representatives. And that's, of course, where we got some of the weirdness.
That is where we got some of the weirdness. When we went into the election, we had a 70-64 DFL majority in the House, and we were really just hoping for some divided government this year. And when I asked for divided government, I actually did not expect that it was going to be a divided House. And we ended up with a 67-67 tie when we woke up on November 6th.
Yeah, I guess you got to be careful what you ask for when you said you wanted some balance. A 67-67 tie is unusual, but it did happen once in the past, didn't it?
It has. If we go back to the history books, and when I looked at the legislative history, we ended up looking back to 1951, and only one time in history, in 1979, did we have a 67-67 tie in the House. But if you actually look at that election, the Republicans jumped from 34 seats in the minority to 67. So they were really hungry for any kind of power at that point. So when you start looking at a 67-67 tie, you had a very deep minority coming up for a tie. So we have had it once.
And yeah, what a massive shift. And so when that happens in the House, and it's evenly split, how do they determine the organizational matters like leadership and committee structure?
So right after an election, the House DFL and the caucus leaders in the DFL and in the GOP meet, and they start selecting their leaders, especially kind of who the minority leader would be, or who the Speaker of the House, the Speaker designate would be. So at that point, the House and Senate decided to pick their caucus leaders. And it's really rare that there's ever a tie in the House. So there's really nothing set in rules or in statute as to what needs to be done. So when we came out with a tie out of this election, we ended up with Speaker Hortman from last session and Minority Leader Lisa Demuth ended up kind of meeting and trying to figure out how do we have a power sharing agreement, and what a power sharing agreement would look like. And that was why they really started having those discussions in November. But then a lot of things, you know, there was a lot of looking back in 1979, where they gave they gave the Republican the speaker, but then a lot of the committee chairs to the Democrats. Representative Demuth and Speaker Hortman decided that they did not like the way that the 1979 power sharing went. So they really wanted to do it differently. The question was, could you have two speakers? And that remains to be seen as to whether you can have two speakers, because the authority of a speaker, there's so much about the running of the House and how to go about that. But that was kind of where they were trying to figure out is how do we both have the role and whether we can both have the title. But then also kind of looking at how do we have co-chairs as well and have the same number of members on the House and on all of the committees as well. So
yeah, so you have those bigger organizational issues, but then at the end of the day, you really do have to work together when you're in that situation, because of the rules that any bill has to get at least 68 votes.
correct, you know, and you know, having this power sharing agreement is not a bad thing. You know, I think the one thing that everybody looked at having a 67-67 tie was you're gonna have to find a way to work together, which isn't a bad thing, because when you have such a, one party, or when you have a, if you go back to those days where you have, 80 members in the majority, you don't have to work together as much. And so that was kind of one of the things, which was how do we really find an agreement that we can work together? For example, they wanted to make sure that, you really start to count votes when it comes to committee hearings. And if you have a tie, well, then you're going to look for when somebody has to go on vacation or when somebody's sick. And, Demuth and Hortman really had the conversation that we weren't going to let somebody being sick or somebody being gone as a reason to take advantage of the other party. And so they kind of really said, well, regardless, you always have to have one vote more. So if there's 14 people on a committee, you always have to have, if you have 7 and 7, you have to have an 8th vote. So it always has to be bipartisan. And, I just listened to Speaker Hortman lately as well. And her comment in those ones, which was, there's still going to be partisan politics. You're still going to have amendments, whether it's in committees or whether it's on the floor, because they're going to have to take those votes. They campaign on a lot of issues. You're going to have these partisan issues. And so, you're going to have them in committee, you're going to have them on the floor, but at the end of the day, anything that comes out of committee or off the floor is going to be bipartisan.
Which is that balance that we're looking for. You want to make sure that one party can't just ram everything through, so that provides that balance. And it sounds like, early on, it was going to be a lot of that power sharing and a lot of making sure that everybody's interests were taken care of. But from election night until now, a lot has changed. The goodwill that existed in certain cases has gone away, replaced by some legal actions, some challenges to different things. And sadly, there was also a death in the Senate that a very popular Minnesota senator passed away, which, kind of challenged the one vote majority that the Democrats had on the Senate side. So first, let's start there. Let's start with the Senate and see what's going on that side, and then we'll turn our attention back to the House.
So looking back at the Senate, we had a 34-33 going into the election. They were not up for election this year, except for, again, remember that Kelly Morrison decided to run for Congress. And so that ended up doing a 33-33. And so there was one special election in the Orono Orono Deep Haven area, and the Democrats ended up winning that one. So we ended up going back to 34-33. And then right before the new year, Senator Carrie Dietzick passed away. She'd been battling with cancer for the last couple of years. She was the majority leader in the 2023 session, but she stepped away last year as her cancer came back. And so with that, we ended up going back to a 33-33 tie, but the governor was able to very quickly, because of that vacancy, able to schedule a special election for that seat. She's Minneapolis, the University of Minnesota area. That is a very heavy DFL area. So that election will be on next Tuesday on the 28th.
Right.
So we will be back to 34-34.
So, but for now, we've got a 33-33 tie. So how's the Senate handling that? Are they handling it well?
We're right now at the 34-33 or 33-33 tie. It's been going great.
Yeah.
I think that's the one thing is that I think, knowing that it's going to go back to 34-33. So they worked together prior to session to come to a power sharing agreement, much similar to the one in the House. So we ended up having, currently right now we have co-presidents. So Senator Miller and Senator Bobby Joe Champion are both presiding as president, and then you have the sharing of committee chairs, and then also evenly split on those committees.
Sure.
So again, it will revert back to the Democrats once the 34-33 go into effect. But for now, they're getting along, and again, not a bad thing.
And part of that, I think, is that they know that it's going to go back to a one-seat majority for the Democrats relatively soon. But before we leave the Senate side, is there anything else that's going on, if that's of interest?
Well,
over there
so there is one little snafu over in the Woodbury area. Senator Nicole Mitchell, if you remember back in April of last year during the Passover spring break, she drove from Woodbury up to Detroit Lakes and allegedly broke into her stepmom's house. And so she's dealing with those proceedings right now. We've dealt with them since last session. If you look at when she got back to the Capitol last year, the Republicans really called for her to resign. The Democrats did not call at that time for her to resign from that seat. They really had her kind of come in. They stripped her of her committee assignments at that point. She was no longer caucusing with the Democrats, but she was still sitting on the floor, and she was still that one deciding vote. One session ended last year. Governor Dayton, the DFL party chair, Ken Martin, and a bunch of the senators did try and have her resign. But she kind of dug in and said that she was not planning to resign at that time.
Right. And her criminal trial is set to start next week, actually. I think she asked to have that criminal trial delayed until after the session.
She did. She asked for that to be, to be pushed out. So last week, the Becker County judge did push that out to the end of session. Okay,
so to sum up, on the Senate side, Nicole Mitchell is continuing to serve. Because her trial was delayed, that leaves the Senate tied at 33-33 until the special election happens next week. And then after that, it'll likely go back to the one-seat majority for the Democrats.
Correct.
Okay, so now let's go back to the House side. There's at least a couple major things that have been going on with respect to House membership that threatened to kind of do away with that 67-67 tie that was reported right after the elections.
So right after the elections, we ended up seeing that the Roseville seat, Curtis Johnson, had a residency challenge. So his opponent, the Republican, filed that said that, that Johnson hadn't lived in the district. And then they quickly did a court proceeding, and it was actually over a weekend. It was fascinating to watch all of the testimony on that one, because Curtis Johnson him and his wife owned a property. They owned their house in Little Canada, and he was renting an apartment in Roseville, which would give him the residency requirement.
Right.
It doesn't take much to establish residency. An apartment, showing up at your apartment, maybe staying at your apartment, having the utilities turned on. A lot of these things are really easy to do. And unfortunately, he did not follow any of them. There was a lot of proceedings, and within the proceedings, they actually had, records of him not even arriving at his apartment. So at that point, the judge did say that he was ineligible to take his seat that he had won. And again, it's a very Democratic seat. So it was one that they really couldn't afford to lose in a 67-67 tie.
Absolutely. So what that meant was that no one could legally take that seat. He was not able to legally take that seat. So because of that, Governor Walz called a special election so that the Roseville voters could have some representation. He called it for the same day as the Senate election that we talked about earlier, January 28th. He really wanted to get both those elections done as quickly as possible.
Correct. So when Curtis Johnson decided to not appeal the judge's ruling, that ended up, and he ended up sending in a letter to the governor saying that he had no intention of taking that seat.
Right.
And what ended up happening was that the governor at that time, he put out the writ, which ended up coming back to in the Republicans and everybody saying that seat was not vacant.
Right.
So when he called that special election in December, Jamie Becker Finn was still the legislator for that area.
Right.
Until session begins, there is not a vacancy in Roseville.
Exactly. And so calling the Senate election at that time worked because the person had passed away and there was no longer somebody who was elected occupying that seat. But there's a big distinction. It didn't work that same way in the House. There truly wasn't a vacancy, or at least they alleged. And then so what happened?
So at that point,
to challenge it?
So the Republican Party decided to challenge it and they took it to the Supreme Court. And so they went in front of the Supreme Court and, said that, the timing, they looked at the statutes, what, Governor Walz and Secretary of State Simon were looking at a different statute than the Republicans were, and where was the timing? And a lot of people really looked at that. Right now, we have a Supreme Court that is 100% appointed by Democrat governors. So a lot of question was, were they going to side with the Democrats or were they going to side with the Republicans on that there was not a vacancy?
Right.
And so that was, that oral hearing was last week as well.
Absolutely. And we now have that opinioned out.
So on Friday, late on Friday afternoon, the Supreme Court came back and they sided with the Republican Party. They said that seat was not open at that time. And so they said that special election could not occur on January 28th. So any votes that had been cast already, that one was completely wiped clean and that the governor would have to set a new writ.
Absolutely. And has the special election been set yet?
It has not been set. And the question became, when will the governor set that one? And he's been looking at the statute, whether it was due to, there's a couple of ways to trigger that, but at this point, he has not put that writ in. We don't expect that he will end up doing that until possibly February 5th, which means we're looking at March 11th, possibly for that one, which means the House will probably not be back to full strength in the Roseville seat until probably about March 17th, so 2 full months after the legislature has begun.
That's a lot later than they expected.
Correct.
Okay, so that's one of the interesting seats. Were there any other interesting ones that the House was kind of squabbling over?
So the other one that there is the Shakopee seat. Brad Tapke won. If you look at election night, we were all staring at a handful of seats, and that one, Aaron Paul had won the seat when there was 100% recording. Aaron Paul had won that seat. And then the Secretary of State's website went blank. And then next thing you know, it popped up and Brad Tapke had won that seat by 14 votes. And so we ended up watching that one, which it went to an automatic recount. And so with the recount, they found that there were 20 ballots that were sent in, early absentee ballots, that ended up being missing. And what we ended up finding is that they were either destroyed or thrown out, and nobody knows what ended up happening with those 20 votes. So that one ended up also getting challenged because of those 20 votes.
Right.
And then Tapke ended up, the ruling also came out the first day of session. It came out the first day of session at like 9:30 in the morning that the judge ended up ruling with Tapke and said that Tapke was officially the winner.
Right. So did that court ruling satisfy the Republicans? Are they ready to accept that Tapke won the election and could rightfully take his spot in the House? It
has not. There's still a handful of, there's still a lot of the Republicans that are really questioning those 20 ballots and what ended up happening with those. Again, you're supposed to vote your ballots are supposed to be secret. And so, even during the trial, they ended up calling some of the people that they presume were those those 20 that we're missing and try and get them to go on the stand and say who they voted for, which again is against kind of what we all stand for. But no, we have not, the Republicans have found that they have the ability, the legislature chooses who they seat. In this situation, the Republicans have not decided whether they are all in agreement to seat Tabke or not, because there are those 20 outstanding ballots.
Right.
So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Sloppy, definitely on the part of the election judges. It's very unfortunate. People talk about whether or not our elections are fair and all that sort of thing. Situations like this, it just doesn't help that situation at all. 20 votes that were counted on election night are just missing. We got to do better than that. And it's unfortunate that it happened in a case where it was decided by so few votes. All right, so that brings us up to speed where we are. And as we looked at heading toward session, there was a lot of sort of banter back and forth between the Democrats and Republicans. And eventually that power sharing agreement got kind of tossed out the window.
It did. Once the Roosevelt seat came back 67, so that we now ended up with 67, 66. The Republicans realized that we will start the session with the majority.
Right.
And so that power sharing agreement kind of went out the window. I think at that point, the Democrats were still kind of trying to figure out how do we get back to that 67, 67. A lot of people just kind of assume that it's gonna be 67, 67. So we should just make all the plans for 67, 67. But again, the one thing that really is outstanding, which is, will they seat Brad Tabke?
Right.
And so there's been a lot of kind of conversations about how do we get to a point. And again, there's still a lot of really hurt feelings from the end of session last year. There's a lot of chaos at the end of session last year. And the Republicans are kind of really looking at this as to, we're going into this with the majority. And so we're going to take advantage of it for as long as we can.
Absolutely. So knowing that the Republicans sort of took that position, how did the Democrats respond? How did they take that situation of the Republicans looking at how they could use that to their advantage?
Well, the Democrats have just kind of, I think they're just kind of really frustrated because they, again, it was one of their members or one of their candidates that really has kind of made them in this position that they're in. The 67, right. 66 is solely because they did not vet their candidate, properly to have a residency thing. So in the end, they, and not having that 67th seat is really kind of impinging on kind of where they're at. So when they started hearing that, that the Republicans are going to show up on the first day of session, they're gonna put the speaker, up in the chair, and they just figured that if we don't show up, then they can't do it.
Right.
And so the question has become as to, if the Democrats just didn't show up for the first day of session, right. Then we're not dealing with whether Tabke gets seated. We're not they're just, they're like, if we don't show up, then they can't do their job either. So
right. Boy, that's just a lot, isn't it? There's still that one major legal challenge. The Republicans assumed that they had a quorum when they had more Republicans there than Democrats. The Democrats don't agree with that thing. So now that's the one big issue that's outstanding, is whether having a 1-seat majority gives you a quorum.
The question became whether you're looking at 134 members, which is where the full strength House of Representatives is at. It's 134. Currently, right now, there's only 133 that are eligible. So right. Are we looking at 134? Or are we looking at 133?
Right.
So based off 133, 67 would make you have the majority, and that is kind of where we're at, right. As to who has the, what is a quorum. But on that first day of session, the Republicans showed up, the Democrats did. What we did find out is that the Democrats on the Sunday night leading up to session had a swearing in of their own. So they were all sworn in at the History Center on the Sunday prior to session. So they are all sworn in as legislators, but they have not actually shown up at their office or at the Capitol since that time.
So here we are we're 2 weeks in.
So here we are, the Republicans have put the speaker in the chair. They've put all their chairs in committees, and they are meeting on the floor. They are having committee hearings. I don't think there's much conversation between Portman and Damon right now, but there is, again, there's more petitions to the Supreme Court, and today there will be oral arguments within the Supreme Court on the quorum question. And the question remains, will the Supreme Court make a decision themselves, or will they throw it back to the legislature to deal with it themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the one big issue that's outstanding. Regardless of how some of these legal challenges shake out, I mean, we're a couple of weeks into the session, but there's a long way to go. They have a lot of work to do. And so at the end of the day, no matter what happens on the House side, they're going to have to get their work done. And the first year of the biennium, which is what we're in here, the big job to do is the budget, right?
It's really the only job that they have this year. They have to balance the budget. Unlike Congress, you can't deficit spend. So they are required to balance their budget by June 30th. The legislature ends constitutionally on May 19th. Unfortunately, Minnesota has a record of not finishing on time. But if you really look at what's on time, June 30th, before you get to a government shutdown, is on time. But the budget is what is required of them this year. Yeah. And right now, there's going to have to be a lot of cuts. There was a lot of spending last year. In the last biennium, we saw a 38% increase in our budget. And we saw a $18 billion surplus wiped out all in 1 year. So we're looking at a lot of one-time spending and a lot of, increase in that budget that's probably not sustainable.
Right. I mean, we know down the road, there's already a projection.
Yep. You're looking out to the next biennium, and it's a $5 billion deficit.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, that's tough. So you're over at the Capitol every single day. You've got a good finger on the pulse. What are you sensing? What are you feeling over there in terms of whether people are ready to work together? I know the Democrats haven't even showed up, but I mean, what's your sense? Or do you think they're going to be able to come together here?
I'd like to think yes. If you really look at kind of how the Senate has kind of been working and kind of how their power sharing agreement, and I think long term, the Senate is really hoping that they can kind of continue this. If you really look at Minnesota, if you look after the elections, we have 101 Democrats in the legislature. We have 100 Republicans. You can't get any more divided with that. What truly is necessary is to have a governor that is able to help lead and help work and put everything together, instead of, just sitting out there and kind of throwing more fuel at the flame, which is kind of where we're at right now. I think, they have to come to an agreement.
Right.
What we saw during the plenty years was that, they threw it over to the courts back, once we got to a government shutdown in the past, and what's essential. And there was a lot of stuff that was what's essential, what's not essential. And the courts said, legislature, you have to do your job. And that's what they really need to figure out, is how do you do your job? There's a lot of bills from the last couple of years that are going to need cleanups. The cannabis bills, we're hoping paid family medical leave. We hope that there's a lot of cleanups and stuff. But I think, once we get past, and maybe it's going to be mid-March, I don't know. But I think when you look at how session's going to end, it's never simple. It's never clean.
Right.
But it's never really done early anyways. And we're looking at, the next set of numbers comes at the end of February. So
right.
Really you're looking at the beginning of March. So what numbers are they really working with? So, I like to think that Minnesota as a state is better off when the legislature is not in session. So the fact that they're not necessarily there right now, you can't get in trouble if you're not there. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, the last thing I was going to say is, that budget is put together by the legislature, but the governor does have some influence in that. And he has put out a budget proposal. And one of the things that it included to raise some additional revenue is another expansion of the sales tax to start covering services. Now, a sales tax was never supposed to cover service items, but the Minnesota rules do. And the governor has proposed some additional changes to the service side of it.
Yeah, and it was interesting because last week the governor released his budget proposal last Thursday, which was actually 2 weeks earlier than it was than necessary by statute. And so I think, whether it came out to cover up some of the other things that were going on at the Capitol, but his proposal came out last week. And what he essentially did was he was going to decrease the sales tax. And as he said, nobody ever decreases the sales tax, but he was going to decrease the sales tax by 0.075%. 0.075%, not 0.75, 0.075%, which is a very small number. But then, as he said, he's closing the loophole on other sales on other services. And when he had his press conference, which ended up being that the closing of the loophole for the wealthy is what he said was it's, taxing your accountant, your attorneys, your bank service fees, your trust. And he was really looking at it to, these are all wealthy people that we're focused on. And so, if you're looking at trying to decrease the sales tax, and broaden the base, then it should end up being revenue neutral. And in the end, this one will probably bring close to 90 to 100 million more into the state.
Right.
And his comments were very, it was, if you're out there trimming your tree and you have to pay, a sales tax on your tree trimming, why shouldn't you get taxed when you call your stockbroker? And it's the rhetoric like that that's come down in the last, 4 years from the federal government and everything, which is, it's always kind of the wealthy. And this sales tax won't just hit the wealthy, it will hit anybody. And as I was talking to somebody, even just not only on bank service fees, it's on account maintenance is what we haven't seen the exact language, but we're hearing account maintenance. We have heard that it won't hit overdrafts. But there, the question is, what will it end up hitting? And until we see that language,
Yeah.
but the Bar Association, they are, anybody that uses a lawyer, whether it's, to get a restraining order, it's just,
Yes.
there's so many things that you're looking at, and it's not just the wealthy.
Yeah, it's always easy to throw out that tax the rich stuff, but in real life, it's always more than that. Well, thank you so much, Theresa. Thank you to all of you for joining in today. Really appreciate you coming along and going through this bumpy ride that we're talking about at the state legislature.
And one last thing, every Friday we send out the political insight. So tomorrow you will get the most up-to-date information, not only on what's happening at the Capitol, what bills we're watching, what hearings we're watching. And we're looking for information on, especially on the sales tax proposal. So any information that we can get, but please make sure you come to Bank Day on February 11th, because the sales tax proposal will be one that we will be talking to our legislators about that day.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Theresa. Thanks everybody for joining us. Really appreciate it, and have a great day, everyone.